Okay, so if people could indicate that they want to ask a question in the usual way, give their name and their organisation so that Nick has an understanding of where you're coming from. And we'll get underway perhaps with one from me. During the course of the last couple of days, Nick, we've had a new concept run past us. That is the concept of illiquidity in superannuation funds and the risk of a run on a superannuation fund. Has this matter been discussed in your office, and what's your view on it if it has?
Thanks, Sandy. Look, I think it is important to think about this issue in the context of where we are with the current volatility in the markets. There's 3 months to go to the end of the financial year. I won't obviously make a judgment yet about what the final outcomes for super funds are going to be, but you all have some idea of where you are in that space, what your likely outcome is going to be. One of the interesting things, we've had negative rates of return before in 2000, 2001, 2002, but of course I haven't seen precise statistics, but it was probably about 40 or 50% of funds on those occasions. So it's not the first time we will have had negative rates of return. But one thing that has changed significantly since that time is portability and choice, and you all know what members can do under those provisions. And if in fact we do have more widespread and deeper rates of return due to the volatility in the markets, and of course there's all the difficulties we're having to face up to as a consequence of subprime, and I won't go into all of those details, it will be the first time since 1987. And the other important point to note is that compulsory superannuation started after 1987, after the great share market crash. It was actually a very good time for it to start. So I have spoken to both APRA and ASIC, and I know they are going to keep a close eye on fund liquidity to ensure that any events that put a pressure on a particular fund are able to be handled. And I think it is important for funds to think about what the possibilities are come July 1 and fund statements are issued. I'd be very, very confident that the vast majority of funds are well equipped to handle the circumstances of negative rates of return if that occurs, bearing in mind 3 months to go. But I do think there is a need to be vigilant about this issue because of the combination of circumstances I've touched on. It's likely to be the first time such a confluence of events have occurred since the introduction of compulsory super.
Okay, first question is on the right.
Anne-Marie Callboy from Hester. Nick, you're right that adequacy is a major issue in the industry, and there's a number of measures that can be looked at in relation to that. Reduction in the contributions tax, abolition, increase in the co-contribution. Obviously, those measures are ones that affect budgetary policy, but there is one measure that doesn't cost government 1 cent that I'd like you to comment on, and that's the abolition of the $450 a month threshold. This is an inequity in the system that affects mainly lower paid workers who work in casual or part-time jobs, and the predominantly women, and who don't get super. And you can have people who are working, in some cases can be working full-time for multiple employers and have no super. And I think it's one of the inequities in the system that's been discussed over a long time, but given that it has no impact on budgetary arrangements, could you comment on when that might get abolished? Thank you.
The 450 minimum contribution limit has been with us for a very long time, since the SG, and most of the industrial arrangements negotiated back at 87 had a lower threshold. It depended on the negotiation. The 450 minimum limit effectively reduces over time for the very obvious reason that it's a fixed money and it hasn't been changed since its introduction with the SG. 450, it's remained at that. And I think one of the few successes from opposition, we did campaign against the proposal to double it and just hold it. So over time it is resolved. The one issue that I would be interested in hearing from industry, from yourselves, is given that you'd have a very low level of effective 9% contribution on a wage salary of less than $450 a month, and I do accept there are many people who have multiple jobs who miss out, who may or may not cross over that threshold, is how you would handle the administrative inefficiency of bringing in what I think would be another 8 to 10% of individuals into the compulsory system. Compulsion currently delivers 92% coverage. Presumably we'd get to 100% of employees. So that would probably be another 750,000 people in the system. Very, very low levels of contribution. How do we handle the administrative inefficiency? So I'd be interested in your suggestions on how we would do that.
Well, we'll promise to get back to you on that one, Nick. A question up the top.
Nick, Joe Gallagher from Cbus. Nick, you mentioned about the lost super and repatriating funds back where they belong. But there is thousands and thousands of workers out there who are chasing unpaid super, particularly in the construction industry, where people are forced to work under an ABN system, and they just don't get it. They're afraid to ask for it. They start a paper chase. It goes on for a year, 2 years, and then they just give up. And on the other side of that ledger, those employers that employ those people, they are at an advantage to the guys that are doing the right thing, paying super. So I'd just like to comment, or ask you to comment, can you guys have a serious look at doing something about that? Not just the construction industry, but across Australia for all industries.
Thanks, Joe. There's two issues. One is the issue of the enforcement of superannuation for an employee within the definition of the SG Act, which, as I understand, is different. It's actually tougher than definition of employee in terms of income tax. So there's enforcement of that provision ongoing, and there's the enforcement and collection of unpaid super guarantee. And the ATO, I know in the last year, I forget the precise amount of money, but have been allocated significant extra resources to deal with both of these issues. The one big issue that really worries me, well, they all worry me, but the one big issue that worries me in this space that hasn't yet had a great deal of attention is what happens in the event of employer insolvency. Because looking at the current statistics, and between 20 and 30,000 employees have outstanding superannuation at any one time, eventually it is collected, and eventually it is collected with penalty. So the member is no better off, is no worse off once the money is collected. But the big problem is what happens with employer insolvency, and anywhere between 8 and 10% of the unpaid SG is never collected because of employer insolvency, and I'd be interested in suggestions as to how we handle that issue, because that is the important leftover work once collection has occurred.
Down the front here.
Howard Rosario from Westscheme. Minister, people in the audience will appreciate why I'm so grateful to you for reaffirming the centrality of the age pension in Australian retirement savings. There's been a lot of mischief around telling people that the pension was going, and I think there's a lot of uncertainty in our community, outlined by some research presented to us yesterday about how people were going to cope when they came to retire. Fortunately, we had Justin Wood come in and also show us how the age pension was a very important part of people's retirement savings. So thank you for doing that for us again. My question goes to your initiatives on the lost members, and I know you've been passionate about this for a very, very long time. We in this conference over here and in other fora constantly get told that we have to improve the level of service to our members. They have more and more money in superannuation, and we have to provide them with a fulfilment of their service requirements, and that's increasing our costs. Now, we've got that pressure coming on us, and at the other end, if we have the lost member register working effectively, as I think you hope it will work, we will get a reduction in the number of superannuation accounts going from about 30 million down closer to the 10 million in terms of working Australians. And you can see then that we will face pressure at the other end in terms of how many people we can amortise our existing costs over. And I'm wondering whether, in terms of your concerns to ensure that people pay a fair price for the services they get, you've seen this dilemma emerging.
Well, yes, I have. I mean, one of the things about our system is it's still mind-blowingly complex. When I first became a minister, I actually asked for the secret government research of the former government on simpler super and the perceptions of simpler super. It didn't take me long to read that no one believed it was any simpler, but they believed it was better. That's why it morphed from simpler to better. That's why it happened. Look, I am very conscious that governments have to weigh up adding extra options to super, and we've got a lot of them in our system. Extra options involve extra cost because they involve extra admin costs, they involve extra decisions, so I'm very, very conscious of that particular issue. And one of my, as I've mentioned in terms of principles, is simplicity. It's all very well having optional extras to a retirement income system, and it is a retirement income system. And conceptually, administratively and from an investment point of view, a compulsory retirement income system should be conceptually very, very simple, but ours is not. I've had a very close look at the developments in the UK. If you want a sort of definitive examination in detail of issues around a compulsory retirement income system, the Turner Commission report, I think, is just first-class work. Don't necessarily agree with all the conclusions, but in terms of analysis, it is first-class work. And it goes to this issue, the central issue of cost, choice, informed choice, optional extras, and the costs of administration that flow. So I'm very, very well aware of it. It will be central to everything we do in terms of policy development. And just very briefly on the age pension, there has been some debate about the 65 age pension age, but what do people forget, aside from the obvious issue that super is an extra to the age pension? What people forget in this country who argue around increasing the access age for the age pension, aside from the equity and fairness issues, it's generally people from a low income socio-economic group who don't live as long for health reasons. What people forget is that our age pension, by comparable standards to other OECD countries, advanced economies, is very low. Secondly, our ageing demographic is not as fast as particularly Western Europeans. And thirdly, we have a means test. Almost no other country in the world has a means test. So the age pension as we know it, I believe, should and will be around for a very, very, very long time. I'll give a 100-year prediction. The one thing I'll give a 100-year prediction on that age pension will be around in 100 years. And I do think that there is a level of mis-selling in the approach that it says put extra money in because there'll be no age pension in 20 or 30 years. It is just a nonsense argument. It's not true. And the other important fact about the age pension is it's actually simple. It is mind-blowingly simple. It's flat, administratively highly cost-effective, and therefore it should and will remain the base of our retirement income system going forward.
I'd like to meet you in the Burnie pub in 100 years and find out if you were right. Up here in the middle.
Angela Ashton from QIC. I've got a question about longevity and the fact that it's obviously increasing. How is the government thinking about how superannuation savings might last through retirement? as a result?
But it's one of the variables you've got to take into account when you deal with the adequacy issue. I mean, what is adequate on today's longevity? Will it be adequate in 30 or 40 years' time? I mean, it's one of the, actuaries will do their best. Will longevity continue to increase? I mean, I've seen arguments it may level off because of issues, modern diseases around obesity, diabetes, cancer, etc. So we do have to be careful about assumptions we make, and that's an important one. One of the good things about a defined contribution system, and again this is why I don't think we need to deal with the age 65 for the pension. We have a low age pension. If a person is living longer and obviously generally in better health, then they are able to work longer. In a DC system, you work longer, you accrue more. So it's effectively self-correcting. That's one of the great advantages of a DC system. There are other issues around adequacy. Is the assumption that 80% of Australians, when they reach retirement, will own their own home going to hold in 20 or 30 years' time? And assumptions around adequacy and outcomes are predicated on 80% of Australians owning their own home and not having the expense of rent in retirement. That's a very critical issue. So it's a really complex debate, and a debate I want to have in the medium term and in a considered way, and hopefully come up with some reasonable conclusions and policy to fill the space.
Here, in the middle. You're next. You're next. Here.
Hello. Hello. Hi there, Colin Tate, publisher of Professional Planner magazine. Nick, up the back this way. Straight ahead, straight ahead. Nick, could you provide us, first of all, some kind of guidelines on when you think financial advice will be tax deductible, and also your views around the provision of scalable financial advice and how that should be paid for?
As I've indicated, the project underway in terms of, let me draw a distinction between information and advice first. The legitimate information that a fund should be able to provide to a member in a very simple form, cost-effective form. That's the first issue to tackle, and we intend to tackle that as part of the changes to FSR and the disclosure regime. Tax deductibility of advice is one solution to the argument around fees versus commissions that I have seen. I'm not sure, frankly, whether it's a solution, but anyway, it's one of the solutions I've seen advanced. As I've indicated, I am interested in the broad issue of governance across the whole system, and the issue of fee structures and conflicts of interest, I think, does fit into that category, and it will be examined in due course.
This time here, number whatever it is.
Catherine James from Investment and Technology. Just picking up on your points on your interest in good governance. Is there any scope for or interest in looking at directorships and people holding multiple directorships on funds that ultimately will be competitors?
So I haven't had that issue raised before. Is there a conflict? Is the workload too great? I'm happy to ask APRA to have a look at it. As I say, I'm not sure they looked at it in the context of the recent implementation of the recent licensing changes.
Up the top.
Here from Bus Q. I sat on a committee of employers and government for the Queensland government, and we found that 40% non-compliance with superannuation in the Queensland construction industry. A lot of those, about 25% of the industry is probably on ABNs, which are sham arrangements to avoid employment conditions. And it appears to me that there really needs to be legislation that applies the 9% to ABN contractors, at least on on the labour component of the contract, and most of them, by the way, are almost all labour, because at the end of the day, who's going to pay when they come to retirement age? So that's question one. No one's asked you the other question, and that is, in a time of high inflation, why are we pumping $36 billion through tax cuts when we need to increase national savings, and it would be better and more effective to pump it into the superannuation space?
Well, on the tax cuts, I mean, Kevin's made it very clear. We gave an election commitment. We are going to deliver on all our election commitments, full stop. So we will not be diverting income tax cuts in superannuation in this budget. The tax cuts will be delivered. And I just think we've got to be a little bit careful here. I understand the broad arguments around savings and consumption, but, you know, fair go. There are a lot of workers out there that are under significant cost pressures, whether it be petrol, food or mortgages. They do need a tax cut. They do need additional monies to pay increasing costs. And as part of the sort of debate, I think, about adequacy, we've got to be very, very careful of in the medium and longer term. We have got to balance in the sense of particularly compulsory contributions from low-income earners against their everyday needs, because frankly they need every dollar they can get to live a decent life. So the tax cuts will be delivered. It's been made very clear. Kevin is very tough. He's very clear, very firm, and he's very tough on us as ministers. What are the commitments made at the election? What's your timetable to deliver them? And they will be delivered, full stop.
Up here, number 4.
Helen Hewitt from the Industry Funds Forum. It's good to have a minister come and talk to us, Nick. It's a bit of a breath of fresh air. My question is about salary sacrifice contributions. It's our understanding that salary sacrifice contributions in excess of statutory amounts are not covered by SG legislation or member contributions. That is, if an employer chooses not to pay those contributions within the timeframes for SG contributions or employee after-tax contributions, there's no legal protection. Now, we've talked to the regulators and Treasury, and they seem to confirm this position, but nothing's been done about it. I'd like to see some greater protection afforded, particularly when workers are encouraged to make salary sacrifice contributions. So could you have a look at this?
Yeah, in fact I have, because we gave an election commitment that where salary sacrifice occurs, and it's a small minority of employers who drop the SG back onto the after salary sacrifice component, that we would prevent that, and we will deliver that on that in due course. I actually did get some advice on the treatment a few weeks ago. I got the advice, and I am told that unpaid salary sacrifice is effectively unpaid wages because it's an employer contribution. Therefore, ironically, if the employer is insolvent, it is covered by GEARS because it is unpaid wages. So in that sense, a person who salary sacrifices their unpaid wages, i.e. salary sacrifice, is protected by GEARS, but the compulsory 9% super guarantee is not. It's a fairly perverse outcome. So the latest advice I have is that there is protection in this area under GEARS of all things, which I must say surprised me, but that's what I'm told is the legal position. As to the issue of the frequency of payment, it is very clear that there is no requirement for the employer to contribute, say, quarterly, together with the 9% SG. The monies can be held back for a longer period. I mean, I think there's a good argument that it should be the same, i.e. at least quarterly.
Time for 2 last questions, one up the top and then one over here.
Steve Rove, First Superannuation. Nick, is there any thought for the Working Party to review the application of exit fees? We're seeing some terrible examples still of exit fees where members are, in order to leave their retail superannuation fund, are being charged $8, $10, $12 and more $1,000 to do so. Just seems it's an area we really should do something about.
Yeah, look, I agree, and I mean, you would have seen Wayne Swan and his focus recently on bank exit fees and some of the anti-competitive issues around it, and it clearly is anti-competitive to have an exit fee. It's a wall that is erected deliberately as a barrier to prevent a person from moving, so it is clearly anti-competitive. And it will... we have a process at the moment called product rationalisation. There are a vast array of different products in the superannuation and financial services space, life insurance, that go back, many, many years. And one of the issues to deal with in this context will be exit fees and how the member or the individual is treated when we have product rationalisation take place. But I just regard exit fees as unconscionable in the superannuation space. They shouldn't exist.
And the last question here.
Yes, Nick, Andrew Wiley from IFS. I just want to go back to your comments about improving participation in the workforce. AIST, amongst some of its policy proposals, has put forward a proposition that women should get paid a baby bonus direct into their super account to make up for the fact that, on the one hand, we want women to be working more and increase participation rates, but on the other hand, we also want to increase fertility rates and the population overall. This would be one way to try and deal with that fact that time out of the workforce means women are always disadvantaged when it comes to superannuation and attracting the SG. So I'd just like to hear your comments on whether you think the super baby bonus would be one way for the government to address that contradiction and send a very clear signal to women that they encourage participation, but they also encourage the question of lifting the population as well.
One of the restraints of being in government, rightly so, is you can't comment about areas outside your portfolio. And I can't. But let me make two comments about the position of women in a compulsory and voluntary superannuation system. Women suffer from two inherent disadvantages. One is, on average, the last time I looked, women on average earn 15% less than males. And secondly, they have significantly greater time out of the workforce for varying number of years because they are still the predominant carer in the event of for children. They're still the predominant carer, so they have significant broken service. And they are the two inherent disadvantages that women suffer in a defined contribution system of income-related retirement income. The age pension, to some extent, ameliorates that because it's a flat age pension. Women live longer, therefore they are greater beneficiaries from an age pension. So I would be, in the context of an adequacy debate, I think that when that occurs, it's important for organisations to make suggestions about how that inherent disadvantage for women can be overcome. I can think of plenty of policy options, but I'm not going to speculate on what they would be today.
Well, Nick, it's great to have a minister who will come and talk with us, not at us, and it's also great to have a minister who clearly knows what he's talking about. Would you join with me in thanking Nick for his time with us?